maps, and meta-analysis. This is Folsom.
Facts.
And faces.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Folsom Facts and Faces. Today, your co-hosts are myself, Justin Hurst, and Maclean and Kelly. And our guest today is George Harris. Really quick, before passing it off to him to introduce himself, we will be covering some of the additional topics that we wanted to talk about post-election, and particularly talking about some of the election design from a state process level, as well as some of the voting procedure and specific issues with regards to voting rights. So, George, if you don't mind introducing yourself, maybe a little bit about your background, and that would be a great start.
So hi everyone, George Harris. I just want to thank the two co-hosts for giving me a space to just talk about some of not only my research but also my previous career experiences. I was a former staffer at the Secretary of State at the California Secretary of State's office, working under Secretary Shirley Weber. I was with her team for about 2.5 years, and then transitioned over to the state legislature where I was a staffer for State Senator Nancy Skinner. And also talking about my research, while I was in grad school, before working full-time at the Secretary of State's office, and while working full-time at the Secretary of State's office, was focused on the election process, voter suppression, and all those things, and how we can continue to get more people to turn out to vote in future elections.
Thank you, George, for introducing yourself. I think you do have a lot of different experiences working within the state, but I think for the context of this episode, we'll probably really be honing in on your time with the Secretary of State as well as some of your research.
Mhm.
While you were with the Secretary of State, what were some of the things that you worked on?
I started, I guess I'll start from the beginning. So I started out as an intern, a graduate student assistant in the office, in the executive office, where we oversaw the functions of the whole Secretary of State agency. And so a lot of people tend to just think about Secretary of State on a national, from Secretary of States, like from each state perspective. You kind of just think about elections, but the Secretary of State in California also oversees a lot of business operations. Small businesses need to register with the Secretary of State's office to be deemed a small business in the state of California. They use the BizFile website, all the Political Reform Act, anything to make sure that there's no gaming the system from politicians and things like that, making sure they're collecting enough money, lobbyists making sure they're following the guidelines and procedures of federal and state law. That's done through the state Secretary of State's office. So there's a lot of different functions that it does, and I just say that to say that that was all the things that we oversaw at the executive office within the Secretary of State. As an intern, started with the community outreach team, where our job was to increase the contacts and access to different elected officials, different agencies across the state. Primarily, when I first started, I was responsible for creating contacts within every city of every county of the state. And there's 58 counties, and I can't even count the number of cities. So it was quite a task to put that contact list together to really just expand our network. Also working with any kind of organization you can think of, whether it's social media, nonprofits, even sports teams, professional sports teams, just like trying to find ways to increase engagement with the public, making sure that how to combat misinformation on social media sites, how to get people that are well-known figures to speak out and get people to encourage them to vote. From there, interned with the cybersecurity team, learning a little bit about the process of how you combat or deter and make sure your system is safe from election fraud. The California voting system is, I don't know specifically if it is the most advanced, but we are multiple steps above the federal requirements, and a lot of states go to us about how to make our voting system more secure and more safe. And it's even more impressive that we have a completely electronic system that does it. The vote count system, which is ran through all 58 counties. It's funny. The second the polls close, you can immediately start counting races just at that, because there's so much electronic counting for voting. So it's a really cool system. Helps us track elections, make them that much more consistent. and easy to follow. From there, and then also part of that cybersecurity voter process, like kind of like election process team as well. After each election, you because the state funds counties to do elections. We also follow up with counties to do audits and make sure that they're using the monies that we send out to them properly. And then finally, I bounced around a few more times. Was with the Strategic Planning and Voters Choice Act team, where I worked on implementing the Voters Choice Act, which is a California law passed in 2016, which required counties to do extensive things targeting outreach to language minority voters, voters with having access for voters with disabilities, requiring early voting in person up to 10 days before the election, and then increasing access to all voting locations being 4 days before the election. It created universal vote by mail, which we have now after the COVID pandemic. But this started back in 2016, and it adds a few more requirements as well to law, just really making sure that counties are going above and beyond to make sure that they're engaging with their communities and making sure people know about the right to vote. And then I did a little bit of work with the legislative team, tracking different policies and bills that pertain to the Secretary of State's office, or different things that we wanted to get done through the legislator that we could not do on our own through the regulation process. And then from there, I was a full-time staffer with that strategic plan VCA team, where we not only worked on the Voters' Choice Act, or VCA, we also worked on the strategic plan for the agency, finding ways to improve and adapt the agency to I think our strategic plan was 2022 to 2027. So really just continuing to modernize the agency and continue to find improvements and strengthen it from the ground up. So bounced around a lot within those 2.5 years, and a lot of unique experiences, which I really enjoyed my time there, to say the least.
Wow, that's George, that's incredible. Definitely glad that we're getting a chance to talk to you about this. Clearly, you've got a lot of experience in the field, which is really, really exciting. I do want to kind of touch specifically on something you mentioned, in that, long history of experience that you've got regarding voter fraud. Now, there is a perception amongst some voters that elections can be rigged, right? And this was a big talking point leading into the 2024 election. And I'm curious, in your thought and experience, how easy would it be for the state to rig an election?
Well, I think the two ways that I see the biggest fear in voting is the ballot drop boxes, um, which I think it's less voter fraud and more mis and disinformation that's being spread around. Um, so for example, in a Voters Choice Act county, you have multiple ways to vote. You can vote at a vote center, which is the new term for a polling place. You can vote right in your mailbox, or you can vote at a secure ballot drop box. So the secure ballot drop box, a lot of people have concerns about voter fraud because they think that anyone can go and just take them. And it's like, first of all, it's a felony to do so. They're bolted down, very secure drop boxes that you really can't do these things with. But the main concern, and this is from the perspective of seeing how you could instill fear in the voting process, is by putting up fake ballot drop boxes. And so you do have election workers in the area that if anyone sees a one that looks like a false ballot drop box, they can report it and they will get taken down immediately. Um, there's so many things on an official ballot drop box that makes it. I've never seen a fake. First of all, I've never even seen a fake ballot drop box. I know that there's a chance it could happen, but the chances are so small. And above and beyond that, they don't look like an official ballot drop box anyway. That's the only way I could really see any type of misinformation being spread about the election process. Because in reality, like I said before, California has one of the most secure voting processes in the world. Sure, we have early voting and vote by mail, but just because you can vote by mail doesn't mean you can vote twice. The second your ballot is counted, it's counted. That's it. You can't go to vote on October 1st via mail and then try to vote in person on the first Tuesday or whatever the election day is, whether it's the 4th, 6th, whatever. It's already counted. You can't count someone's ballot twice. The system tracks each person's name verifies it through a signature. It's just not a reality that it's not a real thing that occurs. And even if it does happen, there are small, very few and rare instances of voter fraud, not really happening at the national level. It more so happens at the local level, if anything. They are caught. There was a case that happened, a very small scale case that happened. I think it was like 10. There was like a changed like 10 votes in a local race, and it was immediately found out. The person was immediately found guilty, and the state was able to take care of it. So, and that's one case out of hundreds of local elections that happen throughout a 4-year span. I mean, there's to say that when you put all of it in perspective, while I understand the risk of voter fraud because that is damage, that's a direct assault on our democracy. The reality is it doesn't happen, and it doesn't happen at a high enough rate. It doesn't even happen at a rate that's worth even like worrying about. It's like the odds of that like there's higher odds. It was like the odds like getting killed by a vending machine or something like that, or one of those like random like obscure things. Like when you compare the two things, it's like it's just such a low chance of happening. And even if it does happen, the state has always found it and identified it immediately. So again, I don't I understand the concern as someone that loves the election process and wants to make sure we have fair and safe elections. I also understand the concern, but I don't think it's something that people need to consider or risk or shouting around and threatening people because of the risk of voter fraud when it's not the risk doesn't it doesn't reap the reward of doing all those activities.
Would you say being struck by lightning is probably more likely than voter fraud?
I would say being
No.
struck by lightning is more likely than voter fraud happening in an election. Yeah.
Okay. I feel like it's a pretty evocative comparison, so hopefully that's
Yeah.
helpful for some folks. Related to that question, from a planning and logistical process, how early are elections planned? And can you walk us through what goes into everything before you have the actual day of voting?
Man, years in a very long time in advance. And I know that because so first of all, there's the thing that gets planned probably the furthest out is just like timing of so we always know when elections are going to be. The presidential primary, I think it's like the first Tuesday of March versus the general election being the first Tuesday, or is it second? Yeah, second Tuesday. No, yeah, first Tuesday of November, and then the midterm election is in June, and November on that same timeline. Um, we always have those because those are statutory guidelines, and there's a lot of statutory responsibilities that the Secretary of State has to have. I mean, 60 days out, they need to be recognizing everyone that has a vote by mail ballot and start sending those vote by mail ballots out. So that means, I mean, there's what, 40 million voters, something around there in the whole state of California. So that means that all 40 million of those ballots need to be created and sent out, which means that for that to even happen, I mean, these ballots are starting to get developed months and months and months in advance to even reach that deadline. And I think it's 120 days before the election is when the voter information guide, which is like that really thick packet you get at the around the election that not a lot of people. I don't know if everyone reads. It is very it is very detailed and dense, but there's a lot of good information in there. I mean that's a statutory requirement to be printed out. I actually got to do a site visit of seeing the voter information guides being printed out, and I want to say that was like in August before the 2021 recall election, and they had been printing them out a month before that at the least. And so, I mean, for them to even get to the printing stage, they have to have the language drafted, in which that process is done. It's finalized by June, because I think that's around the timeline that everything has to be put on the ballot. You kind of have a concrete idea of what's being put on the official ballot between candidates, and then there's the deadline to get propositions put into law. That's also in around June, and like that May, June timeline. Actually, yeah, it's in May to get it put on the ballot for November. It's around in May. So I mean, the second that deadline is hit, the election team is immediately put to work on developing those voter information guides and getting everything finalized. So, and even then, just like knowing, because all of these things have there's so much responsibility behind putting together voter information guides, behind getting the mail ballots out. behind, because we're not even talking about a county level. This is still state level. I mean, just in terms of the planning perspective, like you're still there's still months ahead, making sure that they can hit all those deadlines, making sure the staffing is there, because I mean it is staff that writes all this stuff. There's a person behind the computer putting all this stuff together, which is all really interesting. And then, I mean, from the county perspective, if in a Voters' Choice Act county, I mean, at least a year, because they have to identify all the places that they have a vote center. There's statutory requirements there that if you're a registered voter, if you have 50,000, for every 50,000 registered voters, you have to have one vote center open the 3 days before and election day. So they have to strategically pinpoint where they're going to put those vote centers. Then 10 days before the election, if you have, I believe it's 10,000, no, it's 50,000 or more for the 10-day vote centers, and then 10,000 or more registered voters for the 4-day centers. Sorry. So for those 10-day centers, they have to pinpoint where their 50,000 people lie. So they identify making sure that they have voting locations throughout the whole county that anyone can reach. Because one of the good things about a vote center is that you can vote in any vote center in the county. You don't have to go to your traditional polling place because, things happen. You might work an hour and a half away from your house and you want to vote, but you worked on election day. You can vote at the vote center right after you got off work, for example. So they have to have all of those things pinpointed out. They have to talk about how they're going to outreach to different language minority groups. And the thing is that not only do they have to get all this done internally, they have to go through the public comment phase, and they have to get also approved by the Secretary of State's office. That was one of the things we did on that Voters' Choice Act team, was approving those plans that counties were conducting. So, I mean, all of those processes we mapped out. I want to say like having counties start that a year in advance and having it done 6 months before the election. Yeah, because our deadline was to have counties done this in the 2023 calendar year. We wanted them to have them finalized in that fall, which is about 6 months before the presidential primary in March. So yeah, we want them to have that done in 6 months before, and they get that started. It's a year-long process, roughly. So, I mean, you put that. I mean, that's about that means they're starting the process about 2 years before the election. So a year and a half to 2 years before the election. Yeah. So a lot of steps to make sure that, because I mean, it's just there's so many things that can happen, good or bad, on election day. You might not have enough staff at a vote center when you might not have the language interpreters. So you just want to make sure you can have as many different things that you can think from a logistics perspective answered. You need to have that timing. You need to have that time put in.
All right, thank you, George. Before McLean asks the next question, I have a quick follow-up just on a small point. You mentioned you got to see some of the information packets being printed. Is that all in one location that they print that out, or are there different sites where they print it throughout the state?
The two spots is there's two spots in Sacramento. They're
Okay.
both sites under Department of DGS, Department of General Services. I think that's what DGS stands for. And it's like massive. I mean, it's like this, like it's like the size of like a Safeway. There's this giant printer. I think it printed like 100 voter information guides a minute. Like it was huge. Yeah. No, it was really impressive to see.
That's incredible. This is kind of I guess a little bit of a slightly different direction. But the question I wanted to ask was, to what extent does gerrymandering influence the election process? I know it's a word that is brought up a lot. You hear it online, you hear it on, media, but I'm curious, how much that actually influences it, and from what you've seen.
So I mean, I do want to preface that because California's census redrawn line redistricting is done with community people. While politicians are involved in the process now, it's almost fully community based in terms of the redistricting. So we don't really see gerrymandering too much in California. I don't know the full history of it. I mean, I know that I'm sure that there's been gerrymandering that happened in California in the past, but since about 2010, we haven't really seen too much of the redistricting actually being gerrymandered lines. But in terms of how it can influence an election, and this does happen in other states outside of California, There's a few ways you can do it. So, I mean, for the people that don't know what gerrymandering is that every 10 years, as the census is redone, you get a new estimate of what populations are, whether it's the whole state, cities, counties, etc. And from there, you draw electoral lines. And these lines represent precincts that determine the electoral college. They represent state assembly, state local elected official races, county races, all of these things get factored into that line, into that redistricting process. And so there's some ways that people over the years determined if they can either dilute votes by just saying, say you have I don't know, like a square, and each quarter of the square has X population that you know is going to vote this way. If you draw, say they all live in the corner, like kind of live near the center of the square in a way. Like if you make a circle that's just all of those people in the middle that you know is going to vote one type of way, you effectively have removed their voting power from four districts and just given them one instead. We're like, we're going to give them this seat because they know we have to give them something, but we're not going to make them have these other four, these other three. So that's one method. It's called vote. One method is just concentrating all the vote from one population you don't want to see voting, whether that's any type of party, race, religion, gender, whatever. You want to single them out, you give them that one region. Another thing you can do is draw the line specifically to exclude that population. So now you're saying, we want to make sure this seat is won by this person. This population is not making that happen. We're going to draw the line and cut this little piece of the circle out, or the square out, just to make sure that they don't vote. So those are the two main things: either diluting the vote by excluding them, or concentrating them all into one thing, so their voting power is only put into one place rather than spreading it out to multiple regions. And you do see gerrymandering. Gerrymandering has been around for decades. That's how political movements have swung from the left and the right. It normally is a way, I mean, it's a way for a political party to regain power. So whoever isn't in power, you may see there is a chance that around the census time, that redistricting does occur, and the gerrymandering does occur under that new redistricting. I know there's some suspected cases of gerrymandering that happened in Texas during the 2010 cycle. Um, there was one precinct specifically where a black population was completely cut out of the loop of this district, just to ensure that that population was prevented from voting from whoever they wanted to vote for. So it is very real, and it can negatively impact the election process, because whatever the district is supposed to look like, that's how an election should be determined, in general. It can vary. It does harm and deter the voting process, and the voting integrity.
Speaking of voter integrity, I think that's one good segue into our last question with regards to the security of the vote. And in particular, this is pulling from another talking point that folks have heard a lot about, especially the last couple of cycles. And that is foreign interference. From your perspective, how safe is this process, and is it protected from foreign interference?
I mean, I can speak to I haven't heard anything specifically happen in California. I know that there are things that happen at a national scale that have gone to the news, so I can't really speak to that personally. But I mean, in terms of the California Secretary of State, I mean, there is a full IT team of like 60 people, that are dedicated to the whole time the election. Not only are they working IT just for behalf of the agency, I mean, making sure our websites are running and things like that. But when it turns to election mode, it's all hands on deck, making sure that everything is secure and safe. There hasn't been any, at least since I started at the Secretary of State, there hasn't been any incidents um, of foreign breaching. I know there's always the risk, so they're prepared for it. But to my knowledge, I haven't seen anything that's happened in the past. So that would be since 2021.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing on that topic. I did want to kind of switch over a little bit for the next few questions to talk a little more about voting procedure. And the question that I had, was relating to, some of the work that you've talked about voter, on topics of voter suppression and voter identification laws. I was wondering if you can define what voter ID is for our audience and give us some examples for how that can look?
Um, yeah, so I mean the main thing is making sure, so voter ID law, it really just means that matching a name and any kind of federal information to ensure that you are who you say you are when you go to vote. When you cast your ballot, sure, I can say my name is George Harris. I can say my name is George Harris. If I have an ID that says John Smith, um, my vote should not be counted because I'm clearly not George Harris. So, in terms of photo identification laws, these are laws that are specific around making sure that someone is who they say they are, which in theory, so I'm sorry, this was a two-part, right? Just saying like what they are and then how they can be harmful, or was it just describing what they are?
Yeah, kind of looking to like define what a voter ID is for the audience, and then like what examples of, I guess, of a voter ID itself, like what could that look like?
Oh, yeah. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's just some kind of documentation that describes you are who you say you are. And so, I mean, nationally, every state for first-time voters, they are required to have an ID to vote, regardless of where they are or where they live. So, states on top of that have put it's up to the state's discretion to add or soften the law past that. Because, like I said, every time you first register, you are required to have photo identification, whether that's a driver's license, state ID, whatever. You have to have that type of information to be able to be registered to vote in general. So say I registered to vote back in 2018, I want to cast my ballot in this previous election. In California, I didn't have my ID. I don't need it. As long as I go in and turn in my ballot, I can vote provisionally, and they can either one match my signature to a previous ballot or a previous election when it was done in 2018. A lot of times they also match your signature to when you signed into the DMV. Another way that they can count your ballot is if I bring a utility bill that has my name as well. Or I know in California, we also allow student IDs to be used as a secondary identification. But then you have other states where you may need a photo identification, but you can also vote provisionally and your ballot's counted after the fact, or the most stringent states where no matter what, even if you registered with an ID the first time, you still have to vote. They may count your provisional ballot in the moment, but you have to follow up with the county registrar's office with an official photo identification to vote. And it puts a lot of stringent things on the vote in general, because if you already have if this information is already logged into the system, it shouldn't necessarily be a requirement to add it multiple times, because it can only, the more times you require something to an action to complete an action, you're gonna deter people away, which is also what some there's trends in data that suggest this. My research was not statistically significant, but there are multiple trends within that research that suggest this is may be negatively impacting voting, for instance. Um,
Well, George, I do want to follow up a little bit. It sounded like you suggested that this can be harmful, both in, your follow-up earlier and then also just now how you left off with that question. Um, would you say this is a form of intentional voter suppression when voter ID laws are suggested, or do you think there's maybe ways to? Because I feel like on its face it sounds like it can be relatively benign. So how does that connection happen?
I mean, I think it's naturally a tactic of voter suppression. I mean, the state of California agrees with that because this past year the state legislature passed a law which was signed by the governor that prevents a city or county by adding their own photo identification laws. There was an incident that happened in Huntington Beach in the 2022 election, where they put photo identification laws a requirement. They said you need to have your photo ID to vote. And it went through litigation through the Secretary of State's office and then was eventually placed as legislation, that was then signed. So I mean, the state of California agrees that this is a harmful act. Part of the debates that went on about this legislation was that it is a form of voter suppression. I mean, when you look back into the South, before the Voting Rights Act of 1965, some of the things that were considered tactics to deter voting, I mean, everyone knows about the literacy test, but then one thing was the photo identification, because they could just say, I don't think this is who you are. I don't think this is a legitimate photo identification. And then they would throw it out and then say, you can't vote. Not to say that that's happening to the same extent today. I mean, at the end of the day, we don't know. I haven't been to every single polling place in the state in the nation, so I don't know if that's happening. But I do know that you're adding additional requirements on top of what's required at federal level, which just means you're making it that much harder to exercise a right that you have. If it's your right, you shouldn't be trying to be taking it away to people. You should be trying to give access to it. So that's the main reason why I would consider it to be voter suppression. And like I mentioned, there is research that suggests that as well.
Well, kind of keeping it on that topic and not to, over tap the well of talking about voter suppression. I do, and that's, voter ID seen as a form of voter suppression is one method that's been mentioned, but I was curious if there's other forms of voter suppression that may or may not be common that you're aware of.
Yeah, I mean in my personal research, one of my focus was photo identification laws, but a lot of the things I looked at was not only because that's just deterring people to vote once they get into the polling place and are ready to cast their ballot. What about ways outside of that? How can you deter someone from voting while they wait in line at the polling place? How you can do that also by limiting the number of polling places. Um, One of the things I looked at was looking at polling places per capita, looking at polling places per 1,000 registered voters in a state. And while the numbers are skewed in a state like California, because we have vote centers rather than polling places, you can just put polling places anywhere. Like my grandparents had a polling place in their the garage in the 60s in the Bay Area, but can't have that anymore at vote centers. So we are in that higher per capita place, but granted, we have access to those centers. When you see a lot of the places you see have a lower polling place per capita, you see they also have a higher or more stringent photo identification law, which if I think having more strict photo identification laws correlate to voter suppression, naturally I would think the same thing of lower polling places. When you see a direct trend of all the states that have strict polling places or voter ID requirements also have less polling places, you can see a trend there. So not only do you have less, but you could also have them not equitably targeted to your populations in the county or state you live in. I'm going to use Sacramento, for example, or maybe not Sacramento, like LA, for example. So the majority of people live within downtown, South Central, like these very dense neighborhoods. While granted, there's 5 million people in LA, you only have two polling places in downtown, but then you put five in more suburban areas that there's not as many people that live in, but sure, maybe it's harder. There's less region to get it takes up more space. You're saying, oh, well, we're putting it by geographic space. Well, now those people only have to wait 5 minutes to vote because they have five in their 10-mile radius, and you put five in downtown's 5-mile radius. That's impacting like 1 million people. So people are going to be waiting for hours and hours and hours to vote. So that's one way that actually is still happening. California, like I said, is one. California and Colorado are the two best states in terms of providing access to resources, but there's other states that don't do that. Another thing you can do, Georgia passed a law, and a lot of people are familiar with it. I believe it was like HR, it was whatever Georgia's laws are written as, but it was 209 from 2021, I believe. What the bill does is that it once it was announced that it's signed and become law, it bans any person from giving out food or water or drinks while they're waiting in line to vote. And so the way they were saying that is it's to target solicitors or preventing people from encouraging them to vote a specific way when they get to the polling place to stop electioneering. But I mean, if you have people waiting 2, 3 hours to vote and someone wants to encourage them, remind them why they're doing this just by giving them a piece like some hot chocolate while they're waiting and it's 8 p.m. and it's cold. You want to be able like people want to make sure it really prevents that community part of the voting process, which I think is something that is missing in more recent times. I mean, the election process, even though it's become so polarized, it is a time to celebrate. I mean, it's a day where every person in the world, or not in the world, but every person in the United States is equal. Because whether you're the president of the United States or someone that just turned 18, you all have the same right. you all have that same one vote, one voice that all is weighed the same. And there's not a lot of things in America where you can say every single person in that moment has the same amount of power. Voting is the one, probably one of the very few things in America that we all say we have the same right and power to.
Maybe on the flip side a little bit, are there any sort of election reforms that you have, researched or you're just generally familiar with that may result in a more equitable outcome for the electorate? So something a little more positive.
Yeah, vote by mail by far is one of the most studied and documented resources that provides more access, especially towards older voters. When you're looking at age demographics, voters 65 and up historically have voted at the highest rates. Um, they're also the least I mean, it's harder for them to get around, I mean, older people in general may not drive. They may not take public transport. They may need someone to take them from place to place. If you want to get people that want to vote but may not be encouraged to go to the polling place or vote center to vote, they may not want to wait in line for 2 hours. They may not want to go a couple blocks away to go to the polling place. By giving them the option to vote by mail, it gives them a tremendous asset to actually exercise that right. And you see that once voting by mail is promoted successfully, you do see higher levels of voter engagement as well. So vote by mail is by far the biggest way to increase voting. And I mean, at the end of the day, it's increasing access and opportunities. Like I was saying before, if you create ways to deter an action, you're going to deter activity. If you find ways to promote an action, it's going to promote activity. So vote by mail does that because it's providing more access and opportunities. Um, the vote center model is also shown to increase access to voting because, like I mentioned before, you can vote from anywhere. Like if I work across the county, normally I'd have to go back to my polling place. And some people are like, man, I just got off a full shift. It's 6:30. I'm ready to go home. Like I know I got to vote today, but honestly, I'm not waiting in that line. If you go to votes, I got to drive home. It's already an hour drive, and then I got to go wait in line for an hour and a half. I'm not doing that. But if you go to a vote center, it's like, oh, I can go to this vote center. I can drop my ballot off in the ballot drop box within the vote center, or I can vote at the vote center in person and get it out the way. So I'd say those are probably the two most studied methods to increase voting engagement. Sorry. Yeah, vote by mail and vote centers are probably the two most studied methods to improve voter engagement and voter turnout. And then in terms of not outside of a policy perspective, but creating cultural movements around voting. Um, Within the Black community, there was a Souls to the Polls movement where the churches would engage vote and encourage voting, and it spread throughout all ethnic groups as well, getting churches and large places that people go, that people follow and seen as leaders. I mean, faith leaders are seen as leaders in their community, and people follow them when they tell them to go. Right after service, if they say, oh, right after this, we're going to go straight to the polls and go vote, people would march in groups with their congregations and go vote out. It doesn't happen as often. I mean, you kind of see those actions. I want to say they are positive, but they're normally seen as like actions of resistance against oppressive voter suppression and things like that. So as you see more targeting or deterring people, you kind of see that resistance and like more of a positive light as well. So it's from a policy perspective, there's ways, and also from the community social interaction, finding ways, getting like tell a friend to vote, things like that. They also are shown to also increase and improve voter interaction and engagement.
Awesome, George. Thank you so much for for all of this. I one of the things that kind of stuck out to me while you were talking was the amount of information and like whether it's a piece of legislation that you're quoting or a study that you've read, and I think that we always encourage our audience to stay as well read as possible. Is there anywhere that you found personally that has been really good to kind of read up on? Like, for example, you brought up that mail-in voting is one of the most like studied methods. Is there anywhere where that research lives that, maybe I in my, spare time could go read, or I can encourage other people to go look at that as well?
Yeah, there's a lot of research that's conducted on it. one of the experts in the field. His name is Dr. Barreto. He's at UCLA now, in their political science department. He is one of the experts in terms of voting engagement, how to increase voter engagement and things like that. Professor Tyler as well at Sac State, who's a part of my committee for my thesis, was very big in that as well, big in that space as well. Those are the two that really. I don't personally know Dr. Barreto. I mean, we worked with him at the Secretary of State's office, so I've had a few conversations with him, but I know his research very well. And his research, he did a previous study on voter identification laws and just different ways to increase voter engagement. Professor Tyler continues to do, and I do know him. He's done a lot of good work in this space and continues to do good work in this space. I don't know them at the top of my head. Let me see if I can.
Yeah, and that's okay. If you want to send it to, if you want some time also to send it to us, we would be happy to link any resources that you find in the description for people as well. It was a totally random follow-up question, so if you don't feel obligated to.
Yeah, I gotta find. I have them. I have all the references for my thesis. I just gotta let me look through them and I can follow up and get that information out to you.
Yeah, no worries. And then for our audience, those links will be in the description down below. Which actually, so that kind of leads me right into a kind of our final question. I mean, given all of the everything we've talked about today, one, we really appreciate you coming on and sharing your perspective, your expertise and your work with us. Kind of as an overall sentiment analysis, are you confident in our electoral system to be fair?
Yes. Yeah, I am. I think so. Granted, I have to preface, I feel a lot more confident about the system in California. Um, in terms of from a federal perspective, you know, there is a lot of policies where we're moving backwards in terms of voting progress nationally. Statewide, California is continuing to be a leader in this space. Colorado as well as continuing to be a leader. But one of the trends that I noted from my research, and granted, this was now done in spring 2023. It was finalized in March, May 2023. So it's dated now. Even then, I noted that when I was talking about those photo identification laws, I created a scale that has no kind of restriction to a moderate level restriction, which is like I kind of mentioned it earlier. It's like you can vote provisionally and they match it after the fact. And then that third level, which is the most strict, is that no matter what, you have to come back to the registrar's office within 7 days um, with identification. And so you kind of saw the majority of states had no restriction, and there was the level two and level three, level one being the least strict, two being moderate, and three being most. You're seeing more states moving to that level two and level three strictness. Now it's actually a majority of states in the country, and this was even back in 2023. I haven't looked at it from 2024, but I mean, you're seeing more. I mean, you're seeing more and more states requiring more and more requirements, even though this is the safest elections have ever been. And it's that narrative that's really threatening, and it continues to deter people to vote. I mean, I know there was a lot of. I don't really want to get into the politics of this last election, but I mean, this is one of the lowest turnout elections we've seen in a long time. Is that to say that it's because of voter suppression or other things at play? I don't know, but I do know that this has been one of, as we continue to move this direction, voting is becoming harder and harder, which means less people are going to vote. Like that's just, it just makes sense. If you make something harder to do, less people are going to do it. So with that in mind, we do have to make note of that and say, if we really want do we really want to see everyone turning out, or do we want to make sure everyone that follows the rules and all of this other requirements that we add at the last minute turn out to vote? And I don't really think that's fair when voting is a right that if you're registered to vote, you have, I mean, even if you're eligible, forget being registered, if you're eligible to vote, you have the right to vote. Sure, you have to go through the process to registering, which is just so that way you're in the system so people know that you've done your due diligence and you followed the rules. In my eyes, if you've registered to vote, you followed the rules. Now you just got to turn out and cast a ballot. I think that's the process that needs to be made, because you're just taking away it, you're not necessarily taking it away by adding more, but you're putting more requirements on something that you shouldn't have to, because it's a right that everyone has. So I do think that our election system is fair. I don't think it's fair we continue to add more and more rules and requirements on top of it. That's how I'd answer that question. And we're trending in that direction. Thankfully, California is one of the states that's holding the line, but I am worried about other states across the country and what they're continuing to do. I hope they can follow being a leader like us, follow our lead and go back to the less strict and requirements in the voting process, but only time can tell to see what actually happens.
Well, George, thank you so much for giving us your perspective today. I really hope this was informative for a lot of our viewers, especially if you had some of the same questions that we did. And honestly, we hope to have you on again sometime. This was really helpful.
Yeah, of course. No, happy to come back and share some of the knowledge I have with you all.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Catch you next time.